Thank you so much. Let me take my watch off. I don't want to go over the 3-hour limit they gave me. I'm going to do something that I've never done before, which is I'm going to scrap some of my talk, having listened to Sister Peggy, and talk a little bit more personally about my journey with this ministry. Is that okay with you guys? Yeah, I think it's just more what is called for now. And I'll get to the rest of the talk later. I'll tell you a funny story. As Betty Ann said, I got the chance to meet the Pope, or as I said to a friend of mine, I met the former Jesuit Provincial of Argentina last week. And before I met him, we had a general audience in this committee that I'm a member of, called the Dicastery for Communication at Rome, which is why I was in Rome. And he gave us a talk in Italian, and it was a big group of people, about as big as this group. And my Italian is not so great. And so he kept using the word authentic, authentic, authentic. And after the talk, I thought, well, I think I kind of got most of it. And so I said to someone afterwards, well, I thought it was so great. I was, look how much Italian I know. I said, I thought it was so great the Pope was encouraging us to use the word authentic. And this Italian guy said, no, he was saying how much he hated that word. So I'm like, all right, well, it's a good thing I don't work in the Vatican. But he is authentic, and I thought I'd like to be authentic with you tonight. So I am not as old as Sister Peggy, but I hope I have half the energy that she does when she is 80, when I am 80. I'm 58, and I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s, which means if you watch, the Brady Bunch, that was kind of my life. And when I was growing up in high school, I told some guys from Regis High School this a year or two ago. It would have been, and maybe you guys have a hard time, maybe you accept this or can appreciate this. It would have been unthinkable for anyone in my high school class to come out in any way, or even intimate that they were gay or lesbian, right, or bisexual. The idea of transgender really didn't even exist. I was talking to the kids from Regis. They have a GSA called, it's Spectrum, right? Spectrum. And I said I couldn't even imagine what would have happened. I mean, if it was a boy, he would have gotten beaten up, certainly. He probably would have had to leave school. So that was I was in high school in 1978. I went to the University of Pennsylvania. Go Quakers. And I knew no one who was out. So this is 1978 to 1982. There was at Penn at the time something called Gay Jeans Day. Jeans as in blue jeans. When, to show your support for gay people, that was the word back then, you would wear jeans, right? It's kind of a simple way to show your support, okay? I wore jeans every single day of college except that day. Now, that's not because I was against gay people, but the idea of being in any way associated with gay people back then, this is 80s, 1980, 81, 82, was so frightening for me that I don't know what I wore. I think I only had jeans, so I had to find another pair of pants. So when I entered the Society of Jesus in 1988, I didn't really think about this ministry at all. 30 years ago today, I was a Jesuit novice. I was 27 years old. And what happened 30 years ago, as you know, the martyr of the 6 Jesuit priests and their friends, Selena and Elba Ramos, on the grounds of the University of Central America, really struck me, and it made me think, I don't quite understand what Christianity is yet. Because this kind of witness was so foreign to me. But I understood even at that time that what it meant for people to be martyred was not that they courted death, right? They're not actively seeking death. But even then, and our novice director would tell us this, and other Jesuits, it was that you were standing with people who were marginalized and you wouldn't leave, right? And that because you're standing with people who are marginalized and who are persecuted and who are poor and who are on the outs, as they were in El Salvador, you committed yourself to them, right? The 4 church women in 1980 who were killed, there's a beautiful letter from Jean Donovan who says, you know, one of the martyrs, how can I leave? Who would take care of these people? And I would say that there were times in my Jesuit life where I felt like I was really called to stand with people who were on the margins. I worked with refugees in East Africa for 2 years as a Jesuit, a young Jesuit, and that I felt was a place to stand with people on the margins. So I was ordained in 1999, and I've worked at America Magazine since then, so 20 years before you were born, a lot of you. I would, I had dealings, of course, with LGBT people. I had a lot of LGBT friends. I mean, I live in New York City, for Pete's sakes, right? I mean, it's right. And, some of my closest friends, I know gay priests, gay Jesuits, lesbian sisters. It's just part of the world. Also, I should add, chaste, celibate, faithful to their vows, right? So it was just part of the world. And I wrote things in America Magazine from time to time, advocating for LGBT people, a new term that we were using. GLBT came before that. But I never thought that I would really be kind of invested in that ministry. I think there was a part of me, I'm just connecting this right now as I stand on the stage, I think there was a part of me that was still that kid who didn't want to wear jeans on Gay Jeans Day, right? Because I didn't want to be associated with this group because it was so controversial. I had nothing against them, obviously. But in 2016, as you probably know, raise your hands if you know about the Pulse Nightclub Massacre. Very impressive. So in 2016, 49 people were killed in a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida. At the time, the largest mass shooting in U.S. history that has been sadly exceeded since then. And so I'd worked at America Magazine for 20 years, 15, 20 years, and I knew the media pretty well. And I knew the bishops pretty well, and I knew individual bishops and cardinals, and it's just kind of part of the deal. And I also knew that in any other time when there was any sort of tragedy, natural disaster, shooting, God forbid, the U.S. bishops and the local bishops like that would come out with a statement. It happened the other day in that awful shooting, right? Yesterday or the day before. Like that, the bishops come out with a statement. The local bishop comes out with a statement. The U.S. Bishops' Conference comes out with a statement. And they will say, we stand with the people of, boom, this place, this place. If it's a particular group of people, let's say it takes place in God forbid, a Methodist church. We stand with the Methodists. We stand with our Methodist brothers and sisters. We stand with the people in Santa Clarita. We stand with, as they should, right? I mean, as we should. Because as Sister Peggy was saying, right, we're all brothers and sisters, God lives in you, God lives in me, we're connected that way. But I waited in vain for the bishops to come out and make some sort of statement about Pulse. I couldn't believe it. When the USCCB, the U.S. Bishops' Conference, finally came out with a statement, it was a 2-line statement that did not mention the word gay, and certainly not LGBT. I looked online for silence. I couldn't believe it. This is 2016. And I thought, even in death, these people are invisible to the church. The fact that someone would come in and shoot them was not enough to rouse some of the church leaders mention the word gay. I couldn't believe it, and I was kind of angry. So I did a Facebook post, a Facebook video. It got a lot of hits. And that was okay. And I thought, you know what? I think it's time to kind of step out and start advocating for this poor group of people in the church. So, and this is important for particularly people who are going to a Jesuit school to know, and a lot of my Jesuit brothers are here who know this. I asked for formal permission from my Jesuit superior. I take a vow of obedience too, right? And I knew this was controversial. To accept an invitation from a group called New Ways Ministry that advocates and ministers to LGBT Catholics. I knew the talk was kind of controversial, but I wanted to have permission, so I got permission from my Jesuit provincial, that's the regional superior in New York, and the Jesuit provincial in Baltimore, where the talk was going to go. So I wrote this talk, which was very simple, and it was based on the Catechism, which calls for respect, compassion, and sensitivity for LGBT people, or for people of homosexual orientation. I also suggested that it might be good to look at the gospel once in a while, to see how Jesus treated people who were on the margins. And we know how Jesus treated people who were on the margins. He went to them first. So if you think of someone like Zacchaeus, remember Zacchaeus, the short guy, short in stature? The crowd prevents Zacchaeus from encountering Jesus because he can't see over their heads. And I pointed out, how often does the crowd, how often do we get in the way of someone who has little stature in the church? Zacchaeus is described as short in stature, from encountering Jesus. Zacchaeus has to climb a tree, literally go out on a limb. I know, it's kind of cheesy. But that's what he does, to see Jesus. And when Jesus goes through the town, he points to this guy, Zacchaeus, who's the chief tax collector. And so people would have disliked him a great deal. And says, hurry down, I must come to your house. Zacchaeus comes down with joy because he's been marginalized probably his whole life. Comes down with joy, which is how LGBT people feel when they're finally welcomed into the church. And then, my favorite line in the story, and all who saw it began to grumble. Just go online, An extension of mercy to people on the margins always makes some people very angry. I talked about that. I talked about the Roman centurion. Roman centurion, remember him? Comes to Jesus, he says, my servant is sick. Jesus says, I'll come to your house. No. The words we say every day in Mass, I am not worthy for you to enter under my roof. Jesus says, never in Israel have I seen such faith. The guy's a pagan. Jesus doesn't say, you sinner, you terrible person. Come back after you're circumcised, right? That would have probably changed things a little bit. The soldier would have said, well, he's not that sick. He'll be all right. So the point was, how does Jesus treat people on the margins? So I wrote this talk. It turned into a book called Building a Bridge. And frankly, I thought it was pretty mild. I thought it would be, I know everybody laughs when I say that. I thought it would be like a resource for parishes. And I was surprised at the response, needless to say. The book doesn't challenge any church teaching. It doesn't talk about same-sex marriage. It doesn't talk about anything that's other than just being kind to people and welcoming them and treating them with dignity. But I gave a talk in Boston at a parish called St. Cecilia. Someone loves it. Is that you're from Boston? I can switch my accent if you want now. I do a wicked good Boston accent. You don't? That's so funny. Anyway, so St. Cecilia in the Back Bay, I'd just been there 6 months before, and I thought, no one's going to come to this thing. And It's a very LGBT friendly parish. We had 700 people, standing ovation, people were crying. And I just thought, what is that about? Because the book is I thought, did they read this book? So that happened over and over for the first couple of weeks. St. Cecilia's Parish in Back Bay, Villanova University in Philly, St. Ignatius in New York City. Standing ovations, people crying, people waiting for 2 hours to talk to me. And I had a hard time processing it. And then the second stage happened, which was the pushback, which is kind of something I want to talk to you about tonight. So, a lot of pushback online, which is an understatement. Personal attacks. I talked to someone if I should use these words, and I apologize if they're offensive, right? I'm not using them to offend people, but just to tell you what people have called me. Faggot, pansy, fairy, sodomite, heretic, apostate, on and on and on. Online, it was kind of shocking. And I thought, again, all in the crowd who saw it began to grumble. And I thought, the same thing happens. And it's not Zacchaeus, it's the LGBT person. There were talks I went to that were canceled. The talks that were canceled were about Jesus, not about LGBT people. Talks overseas, talks in the United States. I haven't said this before. I haven't even said it to one of my best friends who's here. Death threats, letters, those kinds of things. You're going to hell. Now, mind you, by this point the book had had the approval of my Jesuit superiors, the Superior General of the Society of Jesus. I'd heard that Pope Francis had liked the book, but that was clearly not enough for some people. So then came protests. I would show up to places and people would be there with big signs, Father Martin's Bridge to Hell. So I thought it was actually pretty clever. People yelling at me, screaming at me. For the most part, though, 99% of the people were very welcoming, right? But there was that very loud, very well organized, very well funded portion of the church that did not like it. And then came what I would call the pushback to the pushback, which was that then some cardinals and archbishops and bishops saw the way that the book was being received and then started to welcome me, like overtly. So Cardinal Supich in Chicago, Archbishop Gregory, your new archbishop here in Atlanta. And then the Vatican invited me to give a talk at the World Meeting of Families in Dublin. The first time the Vatican ever used the term, ever, LGBT. That was in there. And they came up with the invitation. They said, we want you to talk about showing respect and welcome in our parishes, the talk I was going to give you, to LGBT people and their families. That was their title. I thought, that's beautiful, a little move. So I gave that talk. That was protested. It was at the World Meeting of Families. They were so angry that they had an alternate world meeting of faithful families across the street, which actually served the purpose of draining all the protesters and putting them across the street. So it's been a surprise to me. And then, as Betty Ann was saying, I spent 30 minutes with the Holy Father. And I can't tell you too much of what we talked about. He asked me not to talk about it publicly, and now this is being live streamed. I can tell you guys afterwards. No, I can. He said, you can tell groups and individuals. But I will say this. He spent 30 minutes with me. They put it on his schedule, his public schedule. That's how they communicate something. They had a photographer there. And we talked about LGBT Catholics and their joys and their struggles. And I told him stories. And he was very attentive. And I will just say, I came out feeling very inspired, encouraged, and consoled. Okay? So, it's been a very strange journey because I never expected to be aligning myself with this group of people. But I look back to the novitiate and I see the martyrs. I was praying about that this morning, who aligned themselves with a group of people in El Salvador who were thought to be dangerous, beyond the pale. Why are you doing this? And so I feel like this is where God has been calling me, at least in the last couple of years. So that's my kind of personal journey. Let's see how much time we have for the talk. Let's see. Hold on. So, yeah, maybe I'll just very briefly say that I want to tell you a few insights that I've had based on my conversations with LGBT people and with people who minister to them. By the way, next summer, we announced this, we're holding a conference for people who minister with LGBT Catholics at Fordham University. Yeah. It's going to be called, also kind of a cheesy title, Outreach 2020. I know, but anyway. So one of the real challenges, and one of the reasons we're doing it for people who minister, is that there's still places, there's still parishes that don't welcome LGBT people. And I can tell you some of the most incredible stories. I told the Pope some of these stories. One story I heard just last week. Now, I would imagine that most of you guys are pretty open-minded and stand with your LGBT brothers and sisters. By the way, I would say if you're not, you should. No, I know it depends on what school you're in. I know that from talking to people. I do know that. What high school, what college varies dramatically. Varies depending on what town you're in, who the president or principal of the school is, who your bishop is, right? But why would God want an LGBT person to feel less welcome in one place or another? I mean, do you think Jesus wanted someone in Jericho to feel less welcome than someone in Jerusalem? Do you think Jesus wanted someone in Bethsaida to feel less loved than someone in Bethlehem? That's a scandal to me. So the question is, what helps our parishes? Oh, I wanted to tell you the story I heard. What I started to say was, it might be hard for people in this room. I sometimes say this to priests. It might be hard for people in this room, people who are interested in social justice, as you all are. I mean, why else would you take the red eye from LA? By the way, I give you a lot of credit for people with the red eye, and you're still awake. So you might have a hard time understanding this or really accepting this, but these kinds of things do happen. A woman told me that she went to her pastor and came out as a lesbian. She's not in any sort of relationship. And the pastor said to her, quote, "Well, I'm sorry to hear that, because I've been praying my whole life that I would never encounter a gay person." So, cruelty doesn't end at the doors of the church, though. Last year or 2 years ago, a woman called me, contacted me through Facebook and said, "Do I know any compassionate priests in her diocese?" Because she was a hospice worker, and the local priest assigned to the hospice where she worked was refusing to anoint a man because he was gay and dying. So, did I know anyone in her diocese? So you hear these stories all the time. So is it surprising that LGBT Catholics feel like lepers in the church? Lepers. The same is true for families. The mother of a gay teen told me this incredible story. Her son had been estranged from the church from age like 15 to about 21. And he decided to come back, right? Like after 5 or 6 years, to give the church another chance. So they decided that it would be Easter. So he comes back on Easter, sitting next to his mom. Mom's really happy. Priest gets up, preaches the gospel story, right? The risen Christ appearing to Mary Magdalene. And you know what he preached on? Same-sex marriage. Kid let go of the mother's hand, walked out of the church. But there's also stories of grace. I've heard some amazing stories of people feeling welcome in the church. One kid came up to me and said the first person he came out to was a priest who said to him, God loves you and your church accepts you. And the kid said to me, that literally, he said to me twice, that literally saved my life. I said, do you understand what I'm saying to you? He said, that literally saved my life. So we should rejoice that more and more Catholic parishes are places where LGBT Catholics feel at home. And we should rejoice, I think, in two trends that are happening. One trend can be summarized in two words: Pope and Francis. So I want to tell you something to give you guys hope. Because, when I was at Regis in New York, some of the kids said to me, we're really frustrated that this isn't moving more quickly. And I said, look at what Pope Francis has done. He has appointed bishops who are more open and more welcoming. Cardinal Joseph Tobin, who's the Archbishop of Newark, had a welcome mass for LGBT people 2 years ago. Pope Francis is the first pope ever to use the word gay publicly. He has said that he has gay friends, and I know he has gay friends. He said to a friend of mine, God made you that way. He has talked about gay people as people that are part of the family, people who should be welcome. And something that seems very minor, but is actually very important. Pope Francis, a month ago, created, as they say, 13 new cardinals. I hate to make this focus on me, but one of them was the Archbishop of Bologna, a guy named Matteo Zuppi. Great name. It's Zuppi, I was told, not Zuppi. He wrote the Italian language introduction for my book. And I said to someone, isn't it interesting that happened? You know what they said? Oh, it's not interesting. That would have disqualified him 10 years ago from ever being a cardinal. So we need to look at what the Pope is doing and how things are changing in the church. The second trend is a little easier to understand, which is that as more and more people come out and more people are open about their sexual identity, right, their gender identity, more and more families are affected. As more and more families are affected, more and more parishes are affected. As more and more parishes are affected, the church is affected, and things change. So there are these trends. And even if the first trend stops, say the next pope does not decide to appoint people that are so open, right? That could happen. The second trend will not stop. So things are moving. And as I said, we should rejoice that more and more Catholics are finding themselves in open parishes. My own community in New York, my Jesuit community, is right next door to this parish called St. Paul the Apostle, which has one of the most active LGBT programs in the world. The ministry is called Out at St. Paul. I don't know why people always laugh at that, but people always laugh at that. Maybe it's a silly name, Out at St. Paul. Anyway, OSP as they call it. And they sponsor retreats, Bible study groups, speaking engagements. At every 5:15 Mass, when the time comes for parish announcements, an LGBT person gets up in the pulpit and says, hi, my name is Jason, or Jorge, or Marianne, or Joan, and I'm a member of Out at St. Paul. If you are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, you are welcome here. Here are the events coming up this week. But as I said, much of the spiritual life of LGBT Catholics depends on where you happen to live. Right? Now, you can live, for this talk, I'm showing you groups, LGBT Catholic groups in different parts of the world. So if you're here, this group, Fortunate Families, you're in luck. Right? If you're the parent, or if you're an LGBT person, you're in a big city with an open-minded pastor, you're in luck. But if you live in a less open-minded place, or your pastor is homophobic, either silently or overtly, you're out of luck. way that Catholics are welcomed or not welcome in their parish heavily influences their outlook on not only the church, but on their faith. So what helps a parish be more welcoming and respectful? Let me just look at a couple insights. Maybe these are things for maybe some of the few people in the audience who are still questioning or still homophobic or still wondering if this is really a problem. So let me just give you 6 insights. First, they're Catholic. Okay? Might sound obvious, but we all need to remember that LGBT people and their families are baptized Catholics. It's not a question of making them Catholic. They're as much a part of the church as Pope Francis is, their local bishop, or me. So the most important thing that we might be able to do for LGBT Catholics in our schools, our Jesuit schools, our Catholic schools, is to welcome them into what is already their church. It's not your church, it's their church. Right? It's our church. Second, really important. They don't, by the way, this is from the last one was from St. Francis Xavier Church in New York. So that's the family of it, the young gay man in the middle. Is that a great picture? This is from what's called the Ignatian Conference. It's the 28, now 27 Jesuit colleges and universities have an LGBT, they send all their LGBT club, well, how am I saying that? Representatives of the LGBT clubs from the 27 Jesuit colleges and universities get together. It's incredible. They're light years ahead of me. I described it to a friend. I spoke at this conference. This was at Loyola, Maryland. Go Greyhounds. And I described that going to the conference as, oh, there's someone, yeah, thank you. I described it going to the conference as saying to these people, these kids, God loves you. And they're all like, yeah, we know. What else you got? So, second insight, they don't choose their orientation. Sadly, many people believe that people choose their sexual orientation, despite the testimony of every psychologist, psychiatrist, and biologist, and more importantly, my brothers and sisters, the lived experience of LGBT people themselves. You don't choose your orientation anymore. You choose to be left-handed. It's not a choice. It's not an addiction. And it's not a sin simply to be LGBT. Far less is it something to blame on people. Third, they have often been treated like lepers in the church. Never underestimate that. A few statistics. In the United States, lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are 5 times as likely to attempted suicide than their straight counterparts. One study shows that the more religious the family they come from, the more likely they are to want to commit suicide. For straight people, it's the opposite, for straight kids. And one important reason that LGBT youth are homeless is because of rejecting families. So our church needs to be aware of the consequences of stigmatizing and targeting LGBT people, and LGBT kids especially. Fourth, they bring gifts to the church. This is St. Cecilia. This is their LGBT group. That's the pastor on the right. They bring gifts to the church. Like any group, LGBT people bring special gifts to the church. Now, it's wrong to generalize. You know, you can't say all people in this ethnic group are like this, all people in this ethnic group are like this, right? But I think for a group that has felt marginalized for so long, it's important to look at their gifts. People who are on the margins naturally feel compassion. So if you were bullied when you were very little, and someone your age comes to you and talks about being bullied, you're going to feel this natural compassion towards them. LGBT people have felt that marginalization their whole lives, and so they often feel a natural compassion. Compassion's a gift. They persevere in their faith. You know, LGBT people really have to want to be in the church. They persevere, and they forgive. That woman, by the way, who told me about her pastor saying, I prayed that I'd never meet a gay person, she's still Catholic. She's forgiven him and the church. In fact, recently, some American parishes and some schools have fired LGBT people after they were legally married. I'm sure you've heard of this. something about these situations has always mystified me. Every time I'd hear these stories, it would always be about the most beloved teacher, the most beloved pastoral associate, the most beloved counselor. And I work in the media, and I thought, well, that can't be right. How could they all be the most beloved teacher? But then it dawned on me. LGBT people working in Catholic institutions and Catholic schools really have to want to be there, given the way that they are treated. They stick with their ministry and their outreach to kids like you, despite years of feeling rejected. That's why they're the most beloved. It's the same with LGBT parishioners and Catholics. They have to really make a conscious decision. So when you think about those people, you might feel the same way Jesus does when he saw the Roman centurion. Amazement at their faith. 5, they long to know God. This is an LGBT retreat in New Jersey. I showed this picture at the World Meeting of Families in Dublin, and I must have had 12 people come up to me and say, was that an LGBT retreat? That's how foreign it was to some people overseas. They long to know God. Like many Catholics, LGBT people struggle with various aspects of church teaching, like many Catholics do. But most aren't as focused on those parts of the tradition as people think. Most want something simpler. What do they want? They want to know that God loves them. They want to experience community in the church. They want to experience the Holy Spirit through the sacraments. They want to hear a good homily for once in a while. Treat them like that. Not as protesters, but as parishioners. Not as opponents to the church, but as brothers and sisters. Finally, a last insight. This is from the Ignatian Conference, that beautiful picture. God loves them. So should we. And I don't mean I don't mean the kind of love you find online. Stingy, grudging, judgmental, half-hearted, cold, conditional. I mean love, which is the same thing it means for anybody. Celebrating them when life is sweet, celebrating with them, suffering with them. That's the word compassion. Compassion is to suffer with. Suffering with them, being with them, standing with them. Loving them like Jesus loved people on the margins. Remember how Jesus loves people on the margins. He loved them first. Because for Jesus, there's no us and them. It's just us. Right? Jesus was about bringing people from the outside in. And who is on the outside of our church right now, and in many places in our society, on the outside, the LGBT person? And overseas, it's even worse for many people. Sometimes it's better, like in Western Europe, it might be better. In many countries, you can be executed for same-sex relations. Right? This is a place where the church, I think, needs to start to stand. By the way, the other day, Pope Francis, just 2 days ago, said that when he hears about persecution of minorities, he talked about Jews, Roma people, and as he said, people with homosexual orientation, LGBT people. He said he thinks about Hitler. That's how he feels. And in some places, this is the way people are talked about, and it leads to people being beaten, arrested, and executed. It's legal to execute LGBT people in some places. So these are the people on the margins. This is how Jesus treats people. He goes out. He brings people from the inside, the disciples, out. And he brings people from the outside in. So I would say to you, I didn't expect to talk, as I said, as personally as I did at the beginning. I would say to you this. You might think that at your age, if you're in high school or college, there's not a whole lot you can do. Okay, about some things that we talk about here, some political situations, some social situations that might seem overwhelming. But I would say if you know any LGBT kids, especially these days, any trans kids, you could save a life. You could save a life by loving that kid, that friend. You could save a life just by being that kid's friend. In the Catholic Church, we are fond of, and we should talk about being pro-life. I'm pro-life, right? And that includes the lives of LGBT people. The Catholic Church should stand up for these people, particularly in countries where their lives are endangered. But we, all of us in this room, can stand with them here, at a place where suicide is so high among LGBT kids, at a place where their families still reject them, at a place where their parishes still reject them, and at a place sometimes when even their schools reject them. So I would invite you to be pro-life across the board, which also means being pro-life for your LGBT brothers and sisters, because this is what Jesus would do. And if we're not trying to be like Jesus, what's the point? Thanks very much.